filter into the room as we get started here. Hello and welcome to this month's Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center Science Seminar. Today we were going to be joined by Elise Zipkin of Michigan State University, and she's going to talk about her research into monarch butterflies in our region. Before we get there though, there's just a few housekeeping notes. First off, we are recording this seminar, so please mute yourselves and choose whether or not you'd like to have your video on. We will be sharing the recording of this seminar out via email. It'll also be available on our YouTube channel if you want to go check it out afterwards. And we will spend the bulk of our time today. Oops, let me see if I can advance my slides. The bulk of our time today will be spent with Elise's presentation, but there will be time for Q&A at the end. So if you have questions for her, feel free to pop them in the chat throughout, or you can save them and ask them directly at the end of the hour today. I'm going to give a brief overview of who we are before we dive into the presentation. So the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center, or the Midwest CASC, as you'll hear us say throughout today's presentation, is made up of several institutions throughout the Midwest. This is what we call the consortium side of our partnership, and we work with the USGS oops. I'm really having trouble advancing my slides today. So we work to deliver science to help fish, wildlife, water, land, and people in the Midwest adapt to a changing climate. We pursue this mission in several ways. We conduct synthesis research on cross-cutting topics throughout our region. We support a network of postdoctoral researchers and graduate fellows, as well as a tribal undergraduate research program. We host capacity building workshops for our community, which include these science seminars each month, as well as our annual gathering, which I'll talk a little bit more about in just a moment. And of course, we fund climate adaptation research in our region with the USGS. And I am very excited to announce that our registration is now open for our 2023 annual gathering. It will take place in Indianapolis from August 14th through the 16th. And this is open to the entire Midwest CASC community, which includes everyone who is on this call today. So I hope if you are available, you will register, which is free, to join us there for a few days, spending time learning about the research that we're doing, getting to know potential collaborators throughout the region, connecting with partners, all that great stuff that happens when we are in person together. So I will pop that link in the chat, but you can see it's at our website, mwcasc.umn.edu/gathering. You'll find more information and all the details there. Thanks so much. With that, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Alyssa Welch, to introduce today's speaker.
Thanks, Jess. So we are delighted to welcome, as Jess mentioned, Dr. Elise Zipkin for our presenter today. Dr. Zipkin is an associate professor in the Department of Integrative Biology and the program director of Ecology, Evolution, and Behavior, EEB, at Michigan State University. As a quantitative ecologist, Dr. Zipkin connects the complexities of natural communities with the precision of mathematics to shine a light on mysteries in ecology and conservation. She and her team develop analytical frameworks to address grand challenges in the study of biodiversity loss and the effects of anthropogenic activities such as climate change. She leads a Midwest CASC project on the impact of climate on Midwestern butterfly trajectories, which we are delighted to have her present on here today. So with that, I will pass it over.
Elise, if you're talking,
sorry, I'm trying to unmute.
Okay.
You'd think after all this time I would know how to unmute, but well, thank you very much for the introduction, and thanks to everybody for the invitation. I'm so excited to be here, and I'm really looking forward to meeting everyone in person. During the CASC meeting in Indianapolis this summer. I hope to see many of you there. And today I'm going to be talking about why monarch butterflies have been declining and what we can do about it. And this is research I've been working on with my collaborator, Leslie Reese, and her lab, Georgetown University, who's part of our funded grant for more than a decade, probably at this point, almost 15 years. And through this funded project, we brought on several other people from USGS and US Fish and Wildlife Service, which I think has been really useful for us for thinking about how to make this research impactful in terms of on-the-ground conservation. So I'll talk more about them later on, but I really wanted to note how much I think that this partnership between the research and those on ground who've been thinking about, how to deal with species of conservation needs has been really exciting for us. So I know this is just redundant for everybody, but as everybody here knows, species around the world are declining, and that rates of species extinctions are more than 100 times than background rate. And this is just a graph here showing the number of total threatened species out of those that have been assessed by the IUCN, which just continues to increase as we assess more species. So a key challenge, right, is to understand, well, how do we, first of all, slow down these biodiversity declines, but then in the best case, actually think about reversing them. But the problem is, right, protecting biodiversity is not that simple. You can think of, in the simple world, maybe we could just, draw a circle around where these species live and protect this area. But the reality is that there are many different factors that influence species dynamics and their abundance through time. And because of that, it's hard to, even if we could protect their habitat, we may not be able to protect all the things that they would need, to really thrive. And then, of course, the other challenge is that environments are changing at a really rapid rate. So we may not even understand all the different changes that organisms are feeling. And then one thing that'll be relevant for what we're going to talk about with monarchs is this idea that, many species use really spatially expansive habitats. So this is just an example here with the cerulean warbler on the right, where you can just see, it's really using the eastern half of the United States, parts of northern South America for different times of the years. So, it wouldn't even be feasible to think about just protecting or drawing a circle around their habitat and not letting in human use. So we have to be creative, and we have to think about what are ways that we can protect species, knowing the kinds of constraints that we do have going on. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why monarch, about our work that we've been doing to understand monarch declines. And I think this is a really great case study for thinking about approaches to understand and mitigate biodiversity declines, and particularly for thinking about migratory species and invertebrate species and species that use different types of habitat. I think that this could serve as a great example for understanding, what's going on. And some of those reasons are, that their time series suggests that there might be multiple interacting factors. And another awesome reason is that because they're such an iconic and easily recognizable species, there's a lot of data sources in North America. And as you'll see shortly here, the Midwest basically has the largest density of butterfly surveys, structured butterfly surveys really in the world. So it's a really unique place to study butterfly declines. And then finally, the US Fish and Wildlife Service has recognized monarch butterfly declines and, characterized the species as warranting listing under the ESA. And last summer, of course, the IUCN also listed it as an endangered species or threatened. I can't exactly remember the distinction, but really over and over, we recognize that it's an important species to understand what's going on. Okay, so this is just the most recent, well, almost the most recent look at the population. So I'm going to go into the life history of monarchs, which is important for understanding what's going on. But one thing I'll note is that the way that we look at monarch butterfly population size is, we can't count all the monarchs that exist. But what we do is we use data from the winter when the monarchs are in high density, basically in one place, in a few places, in high elevation OML fir forests. And our partners down there who work with the WWF, they delineate the area of the colony sizes and then sum those up. So what you see here is the total forest area occupied by monarch colonies. They're in these dense colonies during the winter. That's our best way of doing kind of a census of the population. And we can see that the population size has decreased quite a bit from when the colony delineation started in the mid 1990s. And you know, it's impossible to say exactly how much they've declined because you know, could be depends kind of when you start in the time series, but it could be as much as 80% in those winter habitats. So to think about what's going on, I first want to show you a little bit about the monarch life history. And I'm not going to match the slide. I always try and do this at the same time and I get off. So we just talked about in the winter, the monarchs spend their time in these really dense colonies in the high elevation OML fir forests. At the end of the winter, so mid-February or so, they start their first migration of the year, and they move out of these colonies and they travel up through Mexico to southern Texas and eastern Texas, southern East Texas, and the surrounding area in Oklahoma and other parts of the southeastern US. And then they reproduce and have their first generation there of the year. After that time, those individuals move up into the Midwest and basically the entire area east of the Rocky Mountains. So east of the Rocky Mountains is all one population. And they produce 2 to 3 more generations, so about 4 generations. At the end of the summer, late summer, that last generation goes into reproductive diapause and then heads all the way back down, so makes that migration in one fell swoop back to those same high elevation OML4 forest locations. And they're about, 13 to 19 different colonies there. And so it's this really unique migration. They're the only species in the world that does this multi-species migration and returns to those same points. So there's this really kind of interesting phenomenon that's going on. And one thing that's important to know is kind of they're interacting throughout that whole area east of the United States. And what we can see from that is that the dynamics that happen in one stage because of that carry over and affect what's going on in other stages. So this is early work that we had done, where we were looking at the number of monarchs in Ohio. And what we had included in there, in addition to local weather variables, we also had some models where we were looking at how is the precipitation and temperature effects in Texas during the spring breeding season or the spring breeding season carrying over to influence monarchs up in the Midwest later on. And what we find is that there's these really big effects. What the spring conditions are like in the spring affect how many monarchs we end up seeing in the Midwest later that summer. So we know we have evidence from many different times of the migratory cycle that what happens, you can't just understand what's going on with monarchs at one location. You have to think about what had happened in the past through their full annual cycle. So there have been several hypotheses about why monarchs are declining. And I'm going to go through the 3 most common ones here and talk about them a little bit. So the first one is the milkweed limitation hypothesis. And a basic idea for that is that the adoption of herbicide-resistant crops led to lower milkweed densities in agricultural fields. So monarchs lay their eggs on milkweed plants. That's their obligate host plants. They use multiple species of it in the family, but they have to use those. And so this theory goes that once, basically in the mid-1990s, when there was large-scale adoption of these herbicide-resistant crops, there was really, really large application rates of things like glyphosate and Roundup, basically. And because of that, the milkweed within all these agricultural areas died out. And then that led to less monarchs because they don't have a place to breed. So that's the hypothesis around this. And so this figure here shows some of the evidence we had for this. So if you look at this graph from 1994 to 2018, on the top, we can see the monarchs. So that's just similar to the bar graph that I showed you. This is the number of, or the total size of that early winter population in the in the wintering grounds. And on the bottom here are the county level glyphosate application rates. So the proportion of crops that are sprayed in each of the counties in the Midwest. So this is across the entire Midwest. Each little line is a different county. And what you can see is from this mid 1990s up to about the mid 2000s, we have this really, really rapid increase of the use of this glyphosate. And then it kind of levels out. So keep in mind that dashed line in there. We're going to come back to that. So that coincides with the time frame that the monarchs declined the most. So the second hypothesis is the monarch migration survival hypothesis. And the idea behind this hypothesis is basically that disease, reduced nectar availability, and maybe winter forest habitat loss has led to lower migration survival and less individuals that make it to the wintering ground. So here, the idea is, well, maybe they're not doing so bad in the summer, and maybe the problem is the fall and the early establishment. So what's the evidence for this? So this comes from basically this top graph where we've got on this one that's in purple. We've got year on the x-axis and then the expected peak summer counts at NAMA sites. So I'm going to get into this, but basically the North American Butterfly Association collects data across the entire United States. And there's been people who do surveys at the, in locations basically since the late 70s. And if we take those locations at the end of the summer within our main breeding range, and we look at what's an index of the size of the monarch population, we actually don't see that decline in the NABA data alone. And so I'm going to come back to that. So that was basically the biggest impetus for this hypothesis. But also there's been other work showing that, yeah, the amount of landscape greenness, which we measure with NDVI, really does affect the size of the overwintering population. So there's been evidence for this as well within the literature. And then finally, the last is the climate change hypothesis. And basically the idea here is that direct and indirect effects of climate change have led to a decrease in the size of the population. And so basically here, it's like that climate is changes in the climate have led to lower fecundity or lower survival rates. And because of that, we're seeing less monarchs. And there's evidence for this as well. And we know that monarchs require a certain number of growing degree days to go from an egg all the way to an adult. And that if it gets too hot, right, they will die. So there's been different evidence as well for this in the literature. So our question was really is, what is the relative contribution of stressors along the migratory route to monarch declines? There's now evidence for each of these different stressors influencing the size of the population, but we want to know, well, how much of each of these things is causing that decline? So my postdoc, Aaron Zeilestraw, led a project looking at this specific question where we integrated data and developed a full annual cycle to look at, okay, why are monarchs declining? So one of the issues with this, though, is that monarch data are incomplete, patchy, and available from different sources. So here's just an example, through this, what we call the main North American flyaway, where we've got different data from different times of the year. And so because of this, what we wanted to do is do a data integration approach where we're integrating the different data sources that we have available and look at a holistic approach, doing a single analysis with what we got. So because I'm a quantitative ecologist, I always go a little bit into the modeling side of it. So I just want to take a few seconds here to just step back and say, what is data integration? So first, with data integration, you maybe heard lots of different names for it: data assimilation, integrated analyses, integrated models. But the basic idea here is that we're taking multiple different types of data and we're analyzing them all together within a single analytical framework. So when we're doing a data integration problem, the first thing that we want to think about is what data are available. So there's lots of different types of data that have been used in data integration approaches, but they're mostly, either related to something on demographic rates, like where we're capturing individuals and following them through time, productivity, or census, presence absent kind of data. Now, in the context of monarchs, right, there's not really that opportunity to capture and recapture them. So here we're just talking about different types of population surveys and census data. So once we know our different data types that we have available, we develop some kind of population model, and we see, okay, what is affecting these different quantities of interest that we want to know, and we can add all kinds of covariates into it, like the different factors of the different temperature or habitat conditions. And then we just develop a model that puts all that together, and that also includes those kind of errors in our data. So we know when we're sampling, we know we don't observe everything perfectly. So here, these little green rectangles are indicative of these error terms in our model. We put together the parameters that we do want to know. That's are in the gray boxes, together with the data that we have, which is those diamonds, those blue diamonds. And then we add in the error that we know that we might be getting from our data to figure out what's going on. So in the case of the monarchs, we developed this integrated full annual cycle model, and we only had data available on monarchs from the late winter to the summer, the summer across the Midwest, and then again in the early winter when they do these counts. So we don't explicitly have data during these migration parts in the spring and autumn. So what we did then is we divided our model up into two different time periods: a summer submodel that went from late winter to summer, and then a winter submodel that went from the end of summer through the beginning of winter. So first, in the summer submodel, what we wanted to do was integrate all the kind of systematic survey data that we had. So the first that I mentioned earlier was these NABA, the North American Butterfly Association census counts. So individuals about once a year go out to these locations, and they try and count, all the butterflies they see within a certain radius and a certain amount of time. So those are indicated here by the blue circles. So there's a lot of, what you can see right away is that they're spatially expansive. So they're covering this whole area in the Midwest, but they're only happening at one time of the year. So there's that limitation. In contrast, we have 4 statewide monitoring butterfly networks. And so those are Illinois, Ohio, Iowa, and Michigan that have started at different dates. And you can see those are indicated with the red points. And basically the cool thing about these is volunteers go out and they walk these transects, which we call pollard walks, where they count all the butterflies within a certain radius detection area. And they do this weekly, every week. So some of these volunteers have been doing this over and over for years and years. So these are really high quality data, because the surveyors, the people, even though they're all volunteers, they're all really into it. They're very well trained. They know what they're seeing. And we get the same kind of consistent data week after week, and sometimes year after year in the same locations. All right, so what did we do? Well, right away, you can start seeing, I'm going to talk a little bit about the model, but right away, you can start seeing that there are potentially spatial biases in these data, right? So the data are collected, guess what? In locations where people are. Not surprisingly, we see this all the time in in citizen science data. So what we wanted to do is first think about, all right, we've got the survey location, but what we're really wanting to understand is what's the average expected counts at a county level. And to do this, what we did is we modeled what's going on at the survey related to what that expected count is in the county. And then we included different things, covariates related to effort and the survey methods. So that's accounting for kind of that spatial bias and the variation that we might see with the different kinds of methodologies. And then what we did is we modeled that expected count on the county level using those ecological covariates. And we broke those up. There are many of them, but they're broken up into several kinds of groups. So first is the size of the population at the end of the winter. Then is the spring weather variables. So that's combinations of landscape precipitation and growing degree day, cumulative growing degree day, so temperature and precipitation. And then summer, the variables for that were both related to the weather, so how hot an average site is through time, but also those variations in growing degree day and precipitation, and also crop cover and herbicide. So how much crop cover there is in the county and how much of that is being sprayed by herbicide in each year. And then the winter submodel, we did this. First, we looked at, the total number or the total size of each of these different colonies. So I mentioned that we have partners with the World Wildlife Fund. And what they do is they aggregate sort of all the counts within these small areas. And they're about, somewhere between 13 and 19 different colonies. And then they also collect information about, what the forest cover looks like in the area outside of that. So we modeled the area covered, that's the total amount covered by monarchs, conditional on it being present. So you can kind of see these are the different colonies on the left there, that sometimes some of these smaller ones have zero, population size of 0 in a particular year. So what's the size of the population given that it was used in a particular year relative to the ecological covariates? And in this case, we use the size of the summer population size, how big the population had got in the summer, the amount of nectar available during that migration south, and what the forest cover looked like in those particular areas around the colony. So how dense was that for fir forest there? And so what we needed to do was link those summer and winter components. So to do that, what we did is we predicted the monarch counts, the peak monarch counts across all the counties. So we had data from a lot of the counties, but not all of them. And we took a weighted average of what those monarch population size were by the amount of unforested land in each county. And so we got a single index value across the year of the monarch counts at the end of the summer. So that peak time, right before that population starts the migration south. And we use that peak summer index as the metric for the size of the summer population in the winter component of the model. So that's how those two were linked together. And again, our question is, what is the relative contribution of stressors along migratory routes? So what we really wanted to be able to do was say, all right, how much is the relative importance of each of these seasonal covariates? So again, we weren't particularly interested in teasing apart the effect of temperature versus precipitation, but we wanted to broadly against our group of covariates, which ones were the most important. So we divided those up into those groups that I talked about. So the size of the wintering population, for example, the spring weather variables, the summer weather variables, and the summer habitat conditions. And we ran groups of our models with and without each of those different variables. And from that, we were able to look at how well the model fits using the difference in the log likelihood value. And we did this for all sorts of combinations of the different, excluding and including all these different variables. And that allowed us to explain how much variance was explained by each of those different groups of variables by averaging the difference across all those log likelihoods. Okay, so and I have to mention this because, of course, this was like the really, really hard part. So I want to really credit Erin with, working through all this. What did we find? Well, we found strong support for the climate change hypothesis. So it turned out the spring and summer weather conditions were more than 7 times more important than other factors in explaining the variation within both the spatial extent and the temporal extent through time. And, there was interesting, we did find this effect of crop area and glyphosate use, but that was attributable more to differences among counties than variation in county. And that has to do with this fact that we were mostly looking at this time period to the right of this dashed line. So unfortunately, due to data limitations, we can't really say what was going on with monarchs during this most steep time period of decline. And so we were looking at this time period from about 2004 onward, when the amount of glyphosate application rates really hasn't changed that much. So it's still having an effect, but most of that is due to spatial differences in the county as opposed to changes in this application rate now through time. And then what we found is when we put that summer index into the model, that almost all the variation, more than 90% of the variation, was explained by the size of the summer population, with only a little bit being explained by how much nectar was available and how much forest cover was available at the wintering sites. And so one of the things that was really interesting from this is we were able to look at, in the past, using our approach, well, what was that monarch count, adult monarch count in the summer? And we could get error bars on this. So using this approach, we did actually find that in the summer population, we see that same decline from the mid 90s until 2018 in the monarch population in the summer. Now, remember I showed you when we only looked at those NABA points, and we didn't use this approach that accounted for the spatial bias in sampling, or the fact that we weren't getting all the locations sampled throughout the season. Yes, we don't see that decline within the monarchs, but once we accounted for that and developed this model that took that into consideration, we do see that decline in the population over that time period. So let's dig into this a little bit. So what was going on? Well, the breeding range is getting warmer. So here, this is now looking at the Midwest. And what we're looking at is the deviations at a particular site of growing degree days for three types of sites. So like a warm, a cool, and an average site. And you can think about that this is in the Midwest. So if we're at a cool site, let's say, somewhere in northern Minnesota, that would be this solid line. Yes, it's better if it gets hotter through time. If it gets hot, if we accumulate more during degree days, then we get a larger population size. But once we get down to average or even warm sites, what we find is that increased growing degree day no longer helps us and even starts to hurt at the warmest sites. So what actually happened? What we found was, this is showing the changes in temperature. So growing degree day from the first decade, so 1994 to 2003, to the second 15 years, 2004 to 2018. So what actually happened in the past is that these more northern sites that were cooler got cooler over this time period from one decade to the other, and these more southern sites that were hotter got hotter. Now, I just want to point out, this is contrary to predictions that we expect to see in the future. We actually expect to see that these more northern latitudes are going to get warmer faster, which I'll get to in a minute, but this is actually what did happen between these two time periods. So this is opposite of what we want. If those warmer sites had been, or those cooler sites had gotten warmer, we might have seen monarchs do a little bit better up there. Okay, so that was kind of our approach to look at, all right, what was going on with monarchs in the past. But it's not just enough to understand these monarch trajectories. We also want to figure out what we can do to mitigate and reverse declines, right? Because that's kind of the main objective. So what we decided to do was project monarch trajectories into the future. And so the way that we wanted to do this is that we wanted to account for all kinds of different uncertainties. And the way that we did this was we have to do two things. Basically, we want to develop this population model that incorporates all the different climate effects, which is what we've just done. And then the second part of what we need to do is we need to project what the climate might look like into the future. And the way that we're doing that is by using multiple global circulation models and multiple different emission scenarios. And so then we can incorporate the different kinds of uncertainty that we have throughout this and understand, maybe what we know well and what we still need more data on to understand. Okay, so first I want to talk a little bit about the climate projections, and this is mostly work that was done by Naresh Upeen, who I saw jumped on the call, so I want to give a shout out to him, and of course there'll be more acknowledgements at the end. But essentially what we did is we have 3 different time periods: a near term, a mid-century, and an end of century time period with 20-year bulk of time, 20 years in there. And for each different region, variable, time period, we use 5 global circulation models. Now, we did this out of, there's a bunch of different global circulation models, GCMs, and it's not clear which ones to use. So what we did is we took the set of about 26 of them that are out there, and we looked at which one of those 26 predicted the particular variables in the past well that we're interested in. So which ones showed good measure for growing degree day in the spring within Texas, and growing degree day precipitation, in the Midwest during the summer. We wanted to look at which had done well in the past to predict our variables of interest. And that, using a quantitative criteria, that whittled us down to 5 different global change models. And then we had 4 different emission scenarios, which range from, low emissions. So that would be like if we met the Paris Agreement, the best kind of scenario, versus, kind of continuing on with what we're doing. So business as usual kinds of different approaches. And then what we did is we projected each weather variable, so the temperature, precipitation, the deviations from the growing degrees, all that sort of stuff, into the future for both our spring and summer weather variables. Okay, and what did we find for this? I just want to show you a little bit what we found. So these different boxes here, so the points in this, these black points are showing what are the average growing degree day and precipitation for this eastern Texas region over this time period of the spring that we're interested in. So what we find is under low emission scenarios, even up through, let's say, moderately low, we don't get much of a change in this box or kind of this region that we expect these values to contain. But of course, as we get higher emission scenarios, what we find is that we expect to see more growing degree days, so it'll be hotter, and maybe slightly less precipitation, but pretty much staying within that same average as what we had. So it'll be hot, a little bit hotter, and maybe a little bit less precipitation, but only if the climate changes in extreme ways. However, what we did find, if we look towards the end of the century in this Midwestern region, is that almost all the places are going to be warmer. And that, of course, is affected by higher and lower emissions. So on the left-hand side, you see, well, if we keep our emissions lower, some of those areas do look like they won't get that much warmer. Some, of course, will get quite a bit warmer. If we get high emissions, it's going to be kind of warmer everywhere, with maybe more extremes in the northern parts of the Midwestern range. And we're going to see wetter summers in the east, but not in the western range. So there's predicted, according to these global climate models, this gradient in how precipitation is going to change. And that doesn't have quite as effect over the emissions scenario. So predicted to be a little bit wetter in this eastern part of the Midwest, and potentially drier in the western part. Okay, so what about then, once we put this all together with our model, what do we find? Well, in looking at the winter population size, we found that the size of the population on average may only be a little bit smaller than what we've seen, but we find high annual variation. So the figure on the right is the same one that we showed before, and I'm showing you this average kind of over this time period. And this dashed line then on this figure on the right, looking at the amount of forest area occupied into the future under different emission scenarios. So the average, the dashed line is what has been the value in the past. So the average from 2004 to 2018. And then these different values, the different colors show the various emission scenarios under different time periods, so that you can see that, we don't see in this next 20 years, so 2023 to 2043, on average, we see the population size maybe being a little bit smaller, but having that's over the average size over those 20 years, but having a lot more variation. And of course, as the time periods increase, and if we do see very high emissions, then we expect that the population size will decline quite a bit through time. But one of the things that we also wanted to look at was what is the number of years that we would expect to see that wintering colony smaller than it's ever been. And what we find with that is we expect that even within the next 20 years, there's maybe going to be as many as 2 times where in a given year, the population will be smaller than its historical minimum, which was 0.67 hectares of colonies or of area occupied by monarchs. So that's something that's a little bit worrisome. Okay, but again, we wanted to focus on, well, what can we do with this information? So we wanted to look then at what was going on what were our projections in this Midwestern area. So what I'm showing you here on the left is what the expected counts were on average in counties across the Midwestern summer breeding range. So this is just the average, and you can see, darker colors indicate more monarchs are produced. And so, well, what do we find? Well, in a low emission scenario in the next 20 years, we find that this is percent increase and decrease, that these areas where the precipitation is expected to increase and not get that much warmer. So that's like the southeastern part of the Midwest. The size of monarch populations may increase somewhat, but areas that are expected to, for example, get much hotter, but aren't necessarily going to, and maybe drier, not going to have quite as much precipitation, we might see monarchs decreasing more there. And then just to point out, kind of under a high emission scenario, in the mid-century, we would expect to see declines throughout. So still overall, the emissions, are really important to keep down. So what are the conservation implications of this work? I think that there are really important things to think about here with this. So first is that we can target restoration and conservation activities into areas where climate is projected to be favorable, right? So we have these different maps under different scenarios, and we have some idea of where within that, Midwestern range, which counties might be best for the specific weather variables that monarchs care about, right? So cumulative growing degrees, precipitation over a specific time period. We know where those within the Midwest, where those areas might be that might be a little bit better and worse. And we can use that to figure out, all right, what is the best location then to, to target conservation activities. And then the other thing that I want to put out, which I didn't go into too much, is that in the short term, I didn't show the results for this, but in the short term, the piece that we have the most uncertainty about is not the climate, actually. It is actually related to how well we can understand what's happening related to weather variables. So in the short term, what we find is that what's giving us our most uncertainty is actually those parameter estimates. So how the monarch population relates specifically to a certain amount of growing degree days. As, of course, we get further into the century and we go further down the line, climate ends up being the sort of portion of the forecast that give us the most uncertainty, right? Because we don't know down the road at the end of the century, how climate looks is really going to have the biggest impact on what we see is going on with the monarch population. But I think this is really important for thinking about the short term. And what this means for the short term is that the different climate emission scenarios aren't going to affect the monarch population size that much within the next 20 years. The thing that we could do to understand what's going on the most is probably to collect targeted data in these areas or locations that are undersampled, right? Because we know, for example, these areas around cities, we have a lot of data around there and much less so in agricultural areas and private lands. So if we could do some kinds of targeted data collections, we might be able to get a better understanding of how the monarch population relates to these different weather variables. And that would help us refine our estimates for thinking about that targeted conservation. And then the next steps to understand Monarch trajectories, and this is work being done by my former grad student, Matt Farr. So we're pretty much done. We just submitted the article. So this is more research for another day, but looking at what is going on with spring. So we know that spring is really important, right? And if you just look at this graph, this is showing that actually the weather conditions overall in Eastern Texas during that, narrow spring window, 1 month window, are really, really important for monarchs. But the reality is those structured data from that time period and that location are just not available. So we don't have a good understanding of what's going on during them. So what Matt's been working on is trying to integrate opportunistic data from the spring with those early structured data. So the great thing is, as I mentioned earlier, monarchs are a really iconic species. And because of this, there's a lot of different data sources available for them through these opportunistic sampling. So things like iNaturalist, eMutterfly, GBIF has different kinds of samples on there. And so we've got all these opportunistic observations of monarchs in Texas during this critical time period. And what we've been working on is integrating them with some more structured data from the early summer to figure out, all right, what's going on across that region within Texas, right? Can we pinpoint in there what's important or how that changes between years to understand what kind of conservation efforts we could do in that Texas region as well. So stepping back a little bit, I think that there's all these really unique conservation opportunities for thinking about kind of how we conserve species and particularly how we do those with data sources that may not be specifically developed or targeted for what our question of interest, right? And I just want to point out that, on SciStarter, there's more than 1,000, citizen science projects, and a lot of those collect data within the Midwestern region. And so for us, there's, different data sources that are really useful for monarchs, but I think that these kinds of data are really going to be able to help us think about, what's happening with some of the cryptic species or species that we can't collect enough data on our own. And so for the next 6 steps, one of the things that we're really interested in trying to do is develop more generalized modeling frameworks. So my colleague, Leslie Reese, who I mentioned at the beginning, she's been developing these databases, looking at traits of butterflies. And we want to think about, okay, how can we extend what we know about the monarch, which is so much detailed information, so much data about this, to understand what's going on for other butterfly species. So she's been developing approach looking at trait to understand what's going on with 26 species that we've kind of our target toy species, example species that we're trying to understand this with. And then our next steps further on would be to extend this to the full community of butterflies in the Midwest. So that's, more than 130 species or so. And use that to help determine, well, what are the conservation priorities for protecting species and communities into the future? And can we figure out which areas might be better or worse for butterflies? And is that going to be the same? What's good for the monarch? Is that going to be good for everything else? That's something that we could explicitly look at that we're interested in doing. So with that, I just really wanted to acknowledge the team members who, from this CASC-funded project who've been working on this research. And it's been a really excited and, really fun project. And, over the past couple of years, we've delved a lot into the science. And I see this next coming year to work more with our U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service partners on this, to think about how do we translate this and use this information in ways that are going to be useful and effective for conservation. And finally, I just want to thank, funders for this work. This is, we're not collecting our own data, but it takes a lot of time to put these models together, to think about what's reasonable, what makes sense to curate the data, and, to put it in a way that's presentable and useful, for not just the scientific community, but also our partners in conservation. So, yep, I'd like to thank the Midwest CASC and everyone else who's helped contribute to this. So thank you. I'm happy to take some questions. Did you want me to stop sharing my screen or?
Sure, yeah, you can do that, and folks can come on video if you want. If you want to speak your question out loud, feel free to raise your hand, and Elise or I will call on you. You can also pop it in the chat. And I see we already have a few in there, Elise.
Okay,
if
so
you
I'm gonna
wanna-
try and look at this. Okay. Question for later. Does modeling impact to monarchs have any application for considering impacts on pollinators that we see? Yeah, so I think that's a really good question. The question is, how much does modeling monarchs or understanding what's going on with monarchs help us understand about getting what's going on with other pollinators species? And I would say that's one of the main things that we want to think about into the future, right? That kind of goes to my question, which is what's going to be saving, if we think about these areas that are targeting that are going to be good for monarchs, is that good for all insects? And that's something we really want to understand more, and something that we're thinking about quite a lot. And I'll just say it, I don't know yet. I think maybe somewhat yes, but also, monarchs, their obligate host family and milkweed that's a little bit different than other species. So the link to agriculture might be different. So I don't know, but I'd like to figure that out. Can you expand on what you mean by structured or targeted data collection? Is that specifically directed at monarch counts, or is that vegetation, precipitation, temperature? I would say monarch counts. So if we do targeted collection, if the thing is, we might not know in certain areas or certain parameter space. So let's say certain ranges of precipitation or temperature, certain locations, if we can do those kind of monarch count data collections in that parameter space that we don't know as well. And that tends to be areas, that are less urban, that are less sampled, then that would help us understand a little bit better of how monarchs are responding to these variables. Is there a reason for the southern cutoff modeled in the summer breeding range? So that was tricky. Yes, we decided on the 38-degree latitude and cut it off at that for monarchs. And because we think of that as the southern limit of where that last generation gets counted to, right? So we want to ultimately figure out how big does the monarch population get at the end of the summer? So that's why we cut it off. That was specific kind of for monarchs. We couldn't really go much lower than Southern Ohio because we don't have the data available as much. There are some NABA data sources, but not none of the other state surveys. Okay. Overwintering monarchs cluster in densely packed colonies, reducing mortality for cold and rainy winter nights and increasing humidity. Is there evidence that changing climate is affecting the density of monarchs and also the total area occupied in winter? So that is such a great question. The answer is that people don't know. It's because it's really, really hard to estimate. You can get anecdotal responses from people who are collecting the data down there. But I don't have as far as I know, there's not, a particular study that's looking at that. But yes, we know that when it's cold, the monarchs are more densely packed. And when it's warmer, they spread out some. So you can find this, when you go and look at the colonies at different times of the year. If you look in January compared to March, right? Like in January, they're tight, they're quiet, and they're dense. As in March, once it starts warming up, they start spreading out. Now, one of the things is that, yes, they are seeing climate changes there. And one of the things that we've seen is that, we get these warmer days earlier in the year. And maybe just get a couple random days. And that actually leads to the monarchs being more active. And some of the hypotheses might be that activity, that reduces their lipid storage, right? Because they're not really feeding during that time when they're down there. And that might lead to lower survival. So these cues, if it gets warmer there and they're being more active at times when they should be kind of pretty still, one hypothesis has been that maybe that's leading to reduced survival. It's really hard to estimate this, and we don't find any strong relationships between that size of the winter or at the beginning of the winter to the end of the winter. So it's not like, you always lose some, right? But it's not like that amount that you lose is we've seen really changed that much. But I think that this is something that we want to get more into as well, with our partners who are collecting those data from World Wildlife Fund. Does Does your method of incorporating climate information use projected normals, multi-decadal statistics, or entire projected time series? So entire projected time series. So that global chain climate model, the way that we do it, we project it out for each. And Naresh, feel free to put some, I saw Naresh in here. You can write the answer into the chat if you want, because he's our climate guru. But basically, yes, we project out for every year using all the sources of uncertainty, and then we aggregate it afterwards. So that's how we're able to look at that uncertainty across those years and times. Okay, they're coming kind of fast.
I know we've got a lot of questions, Elise, and I know you need to hop off right at the end of the hour.
So maybe
we'll
I
pick
should stop it, but I'd be
Okay.
happy to answer questions at another time. And, you know, I love to talk about this. I hope to see many of you at the meeting in Indianapolis, and I would love to hear your thoughts and, you know, what you think is interesting about this too.
Well, Elise, thank you so much for such a good presentation, and thank you all for these great questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them. Yeah, just a fantastic hour with you today. So I am just going to remind folks that we have our next science seminar on June 26th. That is